Good morning, Harvest Springs. It's good to see all of you this morning. So glad that you're with us. My name is Michael. I serve as the lead teaching pastor here at Harvest Springs, and we are delighted that you joined us today. A couple things as we enter into Easter next Sunday. I want to remind you about some resources that we put out last week. There's a 10-day devotional that started this past Friday, leading and following and journeying with Jesus to the resurrection. If you didn't pick one of these up last week, they're available out on the Information Center to help you follow Jesus every day this week through Holy Week. And all the events that are recorded in the Gospels are in there, and with a reading plan and some other thoughts as well. And then if you have interest in celebrating the Last Supper meal with your family or a small group, there is a guide out there and all the things that you need to make this happen as you remember how Jesus reinterpreted this meal that takes place on Thursday, and I encourage you to do that. My kids look forward to that every year, and we will do that this week as a family at our house. We've been in a series on Hebrews, and we're going to continue that today, and today's going to be the last week because Easter is next Sunday. We're going to take a break for next week and then throughout the summer, and then we're going to come back to Hebrews in the fall, beginning in September. So we're going to finish through chapter 7 today, and we'll get back to the rest of Hebrews in September. But Easter's next Sunday. I want to encourage you again to invite people to join us here at our two gatherings and also at the sunrise service. And we also need your help. We need some volunteers to welcome people. We want this place to be hospitable, and we as a church want to welcome people who are coming next Sunday. If you are all interested and available to help greet or serve on our connection team, we have a need for people to welcome with a smile, help people come into the auditorium, find their seats, and we expect this place to be very full next Sunday. If you can serve in that way, stop by the Information Center on your way out today, and I would encourage you to, even as a family, if you want to gather and come a couple minutes early before the 9 a.m. service or the 11 a.m. service and just be outside welcoming people. We would love to have families greeting people and welcoming people into Harvest Springs. And as you come next Sunday, just one other detail. The paved parking lot on the west side of our building is going to be closed. So when you come next Sunday, you can park in the gravel parking lot on the east side of the building, or you can park on the street. We're closing that parking lot because between the services, there's an Easter egg hunt starting at 10:15 through 10:45, and to mitigate any type of accident, we're just going to close that paved parking lot to volunteers who will be here all Sunday. And handicapped will have access to that parking lot as well. So next Sunday, park in the gravel parking lot on the east side or on the street, and during the break between the two services, there's an Easter egg hunt that will be taking place for your kids, and we hope that you can join us and invite people as well. Hebrews chapter 7 will be in today, and if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and turn there, or if you have a device, navigate your way to Hebrews chapter 7. Have you ever studied the history of your family? Anybody into ancestry and family trees and all where your family came from? Some of you, yes. Some of you are like, nah, it's okay. Families are weird. Some of us are all into our families, and others of us, there's this separation that just has happened by life and its situation. But if you study your family tree, chances are you're going to find someone that you didn't know about. You're going to go back in time to meet people that you've never met, but you'll meet them through history. My grandmother always told me that we, on my mother's side, were related to John Adams because my grandmother's last name, her maiden name was Adams. She always insisted, and I believe her, I'm not saying she's making this up, that we were related to the second president of the United States, John Adams, and his son, John Quincy Adams. And today, it's going to be one of those days where we're looking at the ancestry of Jesus. It's going to take us to this unknown. Some of us don't know who this person is. This mysterious man named Melchizedek. And in the argument of Hebrews, the author has mentioned Melchizedek already 2 times in his argument. And today, we're going to focus on who this man is and why in the world would this author bring up this unknown person who appears in just 3 verses in the book of Genesis and is mentioned only in Psalm 110 and then is mentioned 8 times in the book of Hebrews. Whoever this man is, The author of Hebrews wants us as hearers to understand that Jesus is like Melchizedek, but Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. And we're going to follow the argument of this author this morning. And as I've studied this passage this week and prayed a lot about it, I don't want to focus so much on Melchizedek, although it's important that we understand who he is. As we've been walking through the book of Hebrews, I hope by now you realize that the book of Hebrews is all about Jesus. It's about the Son of God, about Jesus. From the very beginning, the author is telling us that God has spoken to us fully in his Son, Jesus, and Jesus was, before time existed, was with God. God created everything through Jesus. Jesus is the exact imprint of the image of God. He reflects the glory of God. He radiates God's very presence while he was human on this earth. He holds the universe in his hands. And this is the Jesus that brings us such a great salvation, as the author tells us. And he encourages us as listeners not to drift from this great salvation, but to listen if we have ears to listen. And so today, I don't want us to get sidetracked by who Melchizedek is or was and what he points to, because ultimately what the author is trying to do is show us that, yes, there was this man named Melchizedek, but he was a forerunner, a type, a trailer to Jesus. So that's how we're going to follow the argument today. And if we were to break this argument down, I believe there are four main arguments that the author is making that I want us to walk through. And then what I really want to focus on at the very end is why. Why does it even matter? Why does it matter that Jesus is a priest that is greater than Melchizedek? And the author at the very end of chapter 7 is going to give us four reasons why it matters to us as listeners today and to his hearers in the original context. Why does it matter that Jesus is a high priest? Why does it matter that he came from a man named Melchizedek? And what does it mean for you and I today? And it's just, God has orchestrated this living, active word. And as I studied this scripture this week and over the past weeks, I am just reminded of how much God's word speaks. And as we enter into this Holy Week on this Palm Sunday today, and the cross lies on Friday, the tomb on Saturday, and the resurrection on next Sunday of Easter, this passage in Hebrews chapter 7 echoes all the events that take place in Holy Week. And I want to point some of those out to you this morning. But as we begin today, the author picks up his argument. And if you were here last week, you realize that the author introduced Melchizedek in chapter 5, and then he stopped his argument for a while to speak to his audience and to say, you're not quite ready for this argument yet, because there's so much to say about Melchizedek, and it's really hard to understand, is what he tells his audience. And then he tells them, as we talked about last week, that growth is expected, that as followers of Jesus, we are consistently and constantly striving for growth, to move from milk to meat, to grow from infants to teachers. And that's God's desire for his people and his followers. And so today, the author is going to jump in to this man, Melchizedek. But first of all, who is Melchizedek? Who is Melchizedek? He's this mysterious figure that appears in the story of Abraham, all the way back in Genesis chapter 14. You may recall this story. Abraham lived in a land called Ur. And one day, God came to Abraham and said, leave your country, leave your people, and go to the land that I will show you. And Abraham, by faith, left his country. He moved from Babylon, and he made his way into what was known then as Canaan. And God said, I promise I'm going to give you land and lots of descendants, and I'm going to make you a blessing for all people. And so Abraham followed God, and he ended up in the land of Canaan, and he took his nephew Lot with him. And when Abraham and Lot got to this new land, they began to settle it. They divided it up, and Abraham went one way, and Lot went another way. And there were already people living in this land, and there were some kings in this land that Abraham and Lot settled in. And there were some kings who began to ally themselves against each other, and 4 kings were against 5 other kings. And this group of 4 kings set out to capture all the cities of the other 5 kings, and some of those cities included Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot, Abraham's nephew, lived in the city of Sodom. And this king came and conquered Sodom and captured Lot. And Abraham got word of this, and so Abraham and his trained men got his army together. They chased this king that took his nephew Lot. They chased him down. They captured all of his men and his plunder from all these cities. And it's during this time in Genesis chapter 14 where the king of Sodom is coming to Abraham, and I think he's about to say thank you for saving my city and my people, and he wants his people back. And in the midst of the king of Sodom coming to Abraham, this mysterious king of Salem appears. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, the story is interrupted, and we get these three verses that mention this man, Melchizedek. It says this, it says, "And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, a priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and some wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. Blessed be Abram, whose name is later changed to Abraham, by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you." And then Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. And if you keep reading Genesis 14, the very next verse goes back to the king of Sodom. And it's almost as if this appearance of Melchizedek briefly comes and it passes like a vapor. Melchizedek enters this story and then he disappears. And yet the author of Hebrews picks up on this brief story and he begins to make an argument about this man, Melchizedek, in Hebrews chapter 7. And he wants his hearers to begin to understand that Jesus and Melchizedek are related. That this is a family tree that runs back all the way past Abraham to this priest king named Melchizedek. And so the author has this in his mind, this story from Genesis chapter 14, and he comes and he makes a great argument in Hebrews chapter 7, which begins like this, assuming that we as the hearers have this background from Genesis 14 about this man named Melchizedek who came out of nowhere, and then he disappeared in the story, never to be heard of again until Psalm 110, and only in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. This is what the author of Hebrews tells us about Melchizedek. Essentially what we hear about him in Genesis 14 and in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1, the author writes this: "This Melchizedek was a king of the city of Salem, and he was also a priest of God Most High." As we walk through what the author says, I want to unpack some of the significance of what he is saying here, that Melchizedek was a king. He was a king of a place called Salem, which is the geographical precursor to what we know today as Jerusalem, which would be a very important place in the life of Jesus and his death. This is Melchizedek. He's king of Salem, but he's also a priest. He's priest of God Most High, the most powerful God in all the universe, the God who created everything. Melchizedek knows this God, and he doesn't just know this God. He serves as a priest, an intermediary between the people and between God. So Melchizedek holds these two functions together, priest and king. And then the author goes on to tell us in the next sentence that when Abraham was returning from war after winning a great battle against the kings, we just read about this, Melchizedek meets and blesses Abraham. And then Abraham took a tenth of all that he had captured in battle and gave it to Melchizedek. So the author is bringing up all these allusions to Genesis chapter 14, but then he gives us what this actually means. He says the name Melchizedek means king of justice. Melech in the Hebrew is king. Zedek is justice or righteousness. So literally what this king's name means is my king is righteous or my king is just. And King of Salem, the author of Hebrews, is associating this title, that he is the king of this geographical location of Salem, And the author translates that to the Hebrew word shalom, which is associated with Salem, as meaning peace. And so this priest king Melchizedek is also, he has these dual roles of priest and king, but he also has these characteristics. He's full of peace and he's full of righteousness. And then the author goes on to tell us this in verse 3 about the silence that we don't hear in Genesis chapter 14. He says, there was no record of Melchizedek's father or mother or any of his ancestors. He has no beginning or end to his life. He, Melchizedek, remains a priest forever, resembling the Son of God. So this author of Hebrews pulls out this mysterious, enigmatic person of Melchizedek from Genesis chapter 14. And his very first argument is this, is that Melchizedek is like Jesus. Melchizedek is like Jesus. And how was he like Jesus? The author tells us in verse 3 that Melchizedek had no ancestors, no beginning. He's like Jesus because in some ways what is not said about him in the narrative is that he seems to be someone who is eternal. He has no beginning. He has no end. Melchizedek is a priest forever. And the author begins his argument by comparing Melchizedek to Jesus. Not Jesus to Melchizedek. He'll get there in a moment. But he compares Jesus as the eternal Son of God to Melchizedek, who seems in this story from Genesis to be this forever priest king. And I want you to imagine. I want to give you an analogy of how this actually works. Imagine you're at the movie theater. You're at the movie theater, and you know that when you go to the movie theater, before the movie actually plays, the movie that you paid to see, there are some trailers that begin before the actual movie. Imagine you go to the movie theater, you sit down, it's dark, you got your popcorn, you've got your soda, you begin to eat, and the trailer comes on, and the trailer plays this trailer from Genesis chapter 14. You get these quick scenes of a mysterious man who appears out of nowhere. He's got bread and wine in his hand. He meets this man named Abraham. And as quickly as he comes, he goes. 2 minutes in, the trailer's over. The lights come on. It's over. You still got a full bowl of popcorn and a soda, and you're waiting for the full featured film to come on, but it's not coming anytime soon. Not until thousands of years later when Jesus comes onto the scene, and it's in Jesus that we get the full featured film that Melchizedek was the trailer to. And it's in Jesus that everything that Melchizedek pointed to is fulfilled. See, Melchizedek is a type of Jesus. He's a prefiguring of Jesus. Some people think that this Melchizedek was an angel. Some people think this was a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus. Based on the argument of Hebrews, I would say neither of those are true, that Melchizedek was essentially a historical man, a king who was the king of Salem. He was the king of righteousness. He was a real person that pointed to Jesus. And Jesus is the full film that shows us how exactly Melchizedek pointed to him, and Jesus fulfilled everything. Melchizedek was the trailer. Jesus is the full featured film. But from the very beginning, the author tells us that Melchizedek is like Jesus. That's where he starts. Melchizedek is the preview. Jesus is the full-length film. The second argument that the author brings into this argument, which we're just gonna breeze over real quick today because I want to focus on other important things in this. Melchizedek is like Jesus, first off, is where the author starts. He's a great priest king. He has two functions together, but Jesus is greater, is where he's going to end his argument. Melchizedek, secondly, the author argues, is greater than the Levitical priesthood. We talked about this a number of weeks ago, that in the Old Testament, that God set up a priesthood through the line of Aaron, which was from the tribe of Levi. And the author is going to unpack how in the story of Abraham meeting Melchizedek, that Abraham tithes to Melchizedek. And because Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, those who came after Abraham, the priest, then tithed all the way back to Melchizedek. And because Melchizedek blessed Abraham, this meant that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham, and Melchizedek as a priest was greater than the priests of the Old Testament. That's essentially what the author argues in verses 4 through 14, that Melchizedek, this mysterious man in Genesis 14, is greater than the Levitical priesthood because it was inadequate to perfect the people of God. And so the author points back to this priest, Melchizedek. The argument begins with Jesus and Melchizedek are compared. Melchizedek is compared to Jesus because he's eternal. He seems to be eternal based on the story that's told in Genesis 14. Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood. And third, the author begins at this point in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 15. He's going to compare Jesus to Melchizedek. How is Jesus like Melchizedek? We'll pick up the argument in chapter 7, verse 15. The author began in the previous section to talk about how the priesthood came through Levi, but here in chapter 7, verse 15, the author says this change, that a priest could come outside the line of Levi, was made very clear by a different priest who was like Melchizedek. Jesus is like Melchizedek, is what the author is trying to say. Because he's appeared. Jesus has come in the flesh. Jesus became a priest, in verse 16, not by meeting the physical requirements of belonging to a tribe of Levi, but by the power of a life that cannot be destroyed. The author is comparing now Jesus to Melchizedek. Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi, he's from the tribe of Judah. He follows this order of Melchizedek because Jesus, like Melchizedek, has a life that cannot be destroyed by death. We know that from the resurrection. And then the author, in verse 17, goes to the only other passage that mentions Melchizedek's name in all of Scripture, Psalm 110. He says, the psalmist pointed this out when he prophesied, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Yes, this old requirement about the priesthood was set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law never made anything perfect, but now we have confidence in a better hope through which we draw near to God. The author compares Jesus to Melchizedek. And Jesus, like Melchizedek, is a priest forever. Forever. If we go back to our movie analogy for a moment, Melchizedek may not be a trailer, he may just be a movie poster. And when I think about movies, there's a movie poster that automatically, when I see it, brings up a scene to mind. Maybe you remember this movie poster that we're going to put up on the screen here behind me. It's going to be there. There it is. There it is. You remember this movie? Maybe I'm showing my age here for a moment. As a child, I remember this movie. I played baseball growing up, and The Sandlot was a classic movie. Some of you still have this on VHS in your house. I know you do. And you can pull it out later today, and you can watch it. But in this movie, if you've seen it, there's this group of ragtag boys who live in this neighborhood together. There's a new boy that comes to town. He wants to make friends throughout the summer, and they get into some trouble. He grabs a baseball signed by Babe Ruth to bring it to a Sandlot baseball game. That baseball ends up over the fence where there is a beast of a dog that lives on the other side of the fence. And there's this story, this legend that is told. And this boy named Squints, who has thick-rimmed black glasses, tells this legend about this dog, the beast, who has taken their baseball and is a threat to their very existence as boys for their summer. And the legend goes that this dog, the beast, used to be this junkyard dog who killed all these thieves that would break in and try to steal all the things from the junkyard. And so the police gathered this dog, the beast, and took it to its owner, and they chained it up, and they left him in this backyard. No one's going to finish this? For how long? Forever. Forever. And it's this exaggerated forever. Melchizedek was forever, the author tells us. And Jesus is like Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the preview, more like the movie poster, because he's the priest that was forever. In Psalm 110, the author makes this chain link, just like that chain link that held the beast behind his fence until one day it gets broken and he chases the boys and they realize that this isn't a beast, it's actually a friendly dog, and they befriend it, and it comes to all their baseball games. Maybe you'll watch it this afternoon if you haven't seen it. But the link is this, Psalm 110, is that Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, in the line of Melchizedek. Jesus is like Melchizedek. So the author began by comparing Melchizedek to Jesus and then saying that this great high priest Melchizedek, who is a king, is greater than the Levitical priesthood. And then the author argues that Jesus is like Melchizedek. And finally, at the very end, the author is going to argue that this great high priest, Jesus, is just like Melchizedek forever, by quoting Psalm 110. But why? Why does this matter? Why does this matter to us today? Why does this matter? The author says in verse 22, let me just read verses 20 through 22. It's that this new system, this new way of priesthood was established by a solemn oath. That Aaron's descendants became priests without such an oath, but there was an oath regarding Jesus, for God said to him. The author is going to go back to Psalm 110. He's going to back up just a phrase. And he puts this psalm in conversation between God the Father and God the Son, that God the Father is speaking to God the Son when the Lord has taken an oath that he will not break. And he says to Jesus, you are a priest forever. And because of this oath, Jesus is the one who guarantees this better covenant with God. The reason this matters is because Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. Jesus is greater than the Old Testament priest. Jesus provides a better covenant and a better access to God the Father. And then the author is going to end the chapter by giving us 4 reasons why. And let me explain these real quick to us today, because this is really, I think, the focus of what the author is trying to say. We may not know about Melchizedek, and chances are you may not read Hebrews or hear about his name for a really long time from now. And that's okay. He's important, but he's not the full featured film. Jesus is the main character of the story, and we have to know Jesus, and so why does it matter that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek? First reason, in 7:23 and 24, the author writes this: there were many priests under the old system, for death prevented them from remaining in office, but because Jesus lives forever, he's a priest forever. His priesthood lasts forever. You see, Jesus is not just this guy that shows up on the scene and then disappears like Melchizedek. Jesus is the eternal Son of God, and because he's eternal, he is forever. His priesthood lasts forever. His forever priesthood is greater than Melchizedek, and he provides forever access to God's salvation. In verse 24, the author says, but because Jesus lives forever, his priesthood lasts forever. Therefore, he is able once and for all to save. Jesus' forever priesthood saves for all time and gives us access to God's salvation. Those who would come to him, to God through Jesus. Jesus provides forever access. The priests would come and they would live and they would fulfill their function in the Old Testament and they would die. The emphasis on what the author of Hebrews is telling us is that Jesus lives forever. We'll celebrate that next week. That the resurrection of Jesus proves that Jesus lives forever. He, like Melchizedek, is beyond the reach of death. So why does it matter? Jesus provides forever access to God's salvation. The author previously has told us that Jesus as a high priest has done all these things. He's the perfect high priest. He's made atonement for our sins. He's made us at one with God. He's forgiven us. He strengthens us in our temptation. He sympathizes with our weakness. He supplies mercy and grace when we fail. He takes away the punishment that we deserve, and he gives us the grace that we also don't deserve, and we can boldly approach God. That's what the author tells us. So why does it matter? Jesus provides forever access to God's salvation first. Second, Jesus intercedes for us forever. If we finish out verse 25, it says, he lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf. We could easily breeze right over this. But this verse, this phrase, this sentence this week caught my attention. Why does it matter that Jesus is a high priest? Forever. Greater than Melchizedek. It matters because Jesus forever intercedes for me and for you and for all those who are followers of Jesus. Jesus right now is at the right hand of God the Father in the heavens, interceding, going between us and God, mediating, invoking God's power and God's presence, and he's praying for you and for me, and he's praying for all believers everywhere, right now. Jesus is forever a priest interceding for us. If we turn to the events of Holy Week for a moment, in Luke chapter 22, Luke records this little conversation between Simon Peter and Jesus. On Thursday night, they're celebrating the Passover meal together. Jesus and his disciples are gathered around a table. They're remembering this Passover experience from generations before. And Jesus leans in to Peter. And in Luke chapter 22, verses 31 and 32, we get this side conversation between Jesus and Peter. And I want you to hear what Jesus says to Peter. Jesus says, Simon, Simon. He turns to Peter and he calls him by his first name, Simon. He says it 2 times. When Jesus says your name 2 times, you better pay attention. And then he says something else that should grab your attention as well. It should grab Peter's attention. He says, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat. Remember, Jesus is in this setting with his disciples. There's 12 of them around a table. They're celebrating the Passover meal. And Jesus tells Simon, Satan has come. He's come to me, the adversary, the tempter. And he's asked permission, just like Job, to come and to sift all of you as my disciples like wheat. And then Jesus goes on to say in verse 32, Jesus says to Simon, but I pleaded in prayer for you, specifically, Simon. I pleaded for you. I prayed for you, Simon, that what? That your faith would not fail. You see the heart of Jesus in this moment. The heart of a priest who goes before God to intercede on behalf of Simon Peter. If you know the story of this week, what's about to happen is, right after this, is that Simon Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. And Jesus finishes this conversation, and he knows what's going to happen. And even in knowing what's going to happen, he prays for Peter. He intercedes for Peter. He's the high priest that Peter needs to get him through the lowest point of his life that's about to happen in just a few hours. In the very end of verse 32 in Luke chapter 22 says this. Jesus says to Simon, so when you've repented and when you've turned back to me again, strengthen your brothers. And Luke records the rest of this conversation. Peter says, Jesus, I would die for you. I'd go to jail for you. Jesus looks at Simon and he says, no. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Luke records exactly what happens. 3 times, Peter denies Jesus. But do you see the care of the priest, Jesus, the great high priest, who prayed for his disciples and prayed specifically for Peter, that his faith would not fail? Jesus knew, and Jesus knows today, that you and I will face trials. You and I will face opportunities to turn our back from our commitment to Jesus, to deny that we even know him. Maybe by our words, more often by the way that we live our lives, we have opportunity every day to deny Jesus. And if Jesus told Peter while he was on the earth that he interceded and he prayed for him, that his faith would not fail, how much more does Jesus now, in the presence of God the Father, who's sitting on his throne, and the Son of God is at his right hand, how much more does Jesus, the great high priest, pray for me and pray for you, that our faith would never fail, that our faith would be strong. That's why it matters that Jesus is a high priest. Jesus desires that we are faithful, that we endure, that like him, we endure through things that we may not think have our best interests in mind, that even are painful, like the cross. And Jesus, the great high priest, intercedes for us, that your faith would remain strong. Because he knows there's an adversary who wants to sift all of us like wheat. But we have a God who sent his Son, who intercedes for us, that our faith is strong. And that should encourage us, church. And no matter what happens in our faith journey, we have a high priest who is praying for us that we are faithful to him, that our faith would never fail. Jesus intercedes for us forever. He's doing it now, and he'll do that forever until he returns. So why does it matter that Jesus is a high priest? It matters because he gives access to God's salvation forever for everyone. It matters because he intercedes for you and for me and for all believers. It matters because Jesus' holy character places him forever in God's holy presence. In chapter 7, verse 26, it says this. It says that Jesus is the kind of high priest we need. Jesus is the kind of high priest we need, and this is the reason why. Because he's holy. He's blameless. He's unstained by sin. He's been set apart from sinners, and he has been given the highest place of honor in heaven. This is the very character of who Jesus is. He's holy. He's blameless. He's not stained by sin. And he's in God's holy presence because he is holy himself. He can be in the holy presence of God. His character is what gives him access. And then lastly, why do we need a high priest like Jesus, better than Melchizedek? He gives us forever access to God through his salvation. He always forever intercedes for us. His character places him forever in God's holy presence. And lastly, is that Jesus offered himself as a once and forever sacrifice. The last 2 verses of chapter 7, the author concludes this way. He says, unlike the other high priests, Jesus does not need to offer sacrifices every day. They did this for their own sins and for the sins of the people, but Jesus did this once for all when he offered himself as the sacrifice for the people's sins. The law appointed high priests who were limited by human weakness, but after the law was given, God appointed his Son with an oath. And his Son has been made the perfect high priest forever. See, we need Jesus to be a high priest for us because he offered himself as the once and forever sacrifice that you and I need to have access to God's salvation. Unlike the priests of the Old Testament who offered sacrifice daily, Jesus offered himself one time on the cross. And that one sacrifice was good forever, for the rest of time. And there's no need to keep offering sacrifice. Jesus was the perfect, spotless lamb. His character of perfection and holiness mirrored that of the Passover lamb that was selected in Egypt, that was taken in by a family, that was slaughtered, and its blood was put on the doorpost of their home to protect them from God's agent of death. And it's fitting that Jesus would gather this week with his disciples in the historical events that led him to the cross, and they would celebrate this Passover meal that remembered this act generations before. And Jesus, in the midst of that meal, reinterprets that to be himself. He says, "My sacrifice in my blood is sufficient for you." Jesus offered himself as this once and forever sacrifice through his death on the cross. His sacrifice is sufficient. His access to God is immediate and unbroken. And his priestly intercession for you and for me is forever. And his salvation in him and him alone is absolute. That's why we need a Savior and a priest like Jesus. See, this story that had its preview or poster all the way back in Melchizedek is one continuous story. And the full movie is seen in Jesus, who is the true priest king. He's eternal. Not because the Bible leaves out his genealogy, because it does include his genealogy, that God sent his Spirit to cause a virgin to have a baby that was born in Bethlehem. Jesus is eternal. He stepped out of heaven and he entered into the womb of a woman to be born like you and for me. Jesus, like Melchizedek, brings bread and wine, but he doesn't bring bread and wine. He offers his own body, his broken body, and his shed blood for us. Jesus is like Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is like Jesus, but unlike Melchizedek, Jesus' resurrection proves that he conquers death, and he lives forever. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, but Jesus blesses everyone through his death. Melchizedek was the king of peace. Jesus is our peace. Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the trailer. Jesus is the full featured film. And as we follow these events of Holy Week this week, we'll see how Jesus in his life and his death entered into this experience that all of us will, and he was raised back to life for our salvation and for the salvation of everyone. This is why Jesus as a high priest matters. It matters because it affects us. It affects our eternity. Jesus as a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek is always forever at God's right hand interceding for us. His salvation is available forever for everyone. And today, if you don't know this salvation, it's available to you, and it's available right now. I invite you to set your things aside, and we're going to spend a few moments of prayer and response. If you've never put your faith in Jesus, today can be the day of salvation, when the once and for all sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross cleanses you of your sins, washes you white as snow, and makes you new, takes you from death to life. I invite you to bow your head and close your eyes.